The train arrived long after dark, its iron wheels screaming as they slowed against the frozen tracks. Snow fell in thick, blinding sheets, swallowing the small frontier station until it looked more like a forgotten shed than a place where lives could change. The lanterns burned low, their yellow light trembling in the wind, and beyond them stretched miles of empty prairie white, silent, unforgiving. She stepped down from the last carriage with trembling legs. Her coat was too thin for the winter storm, patched and worn at the elbows, and her boots were cracked from years of hard use. Everything she owned fit inside a small, fraying carpet bag clutched to her chest. When the conductor called out her stop, there was no family waiting, no welcoming arms, only the snow and the ache of uncertainty in her bones. She had been sent here as a mail-order bride, promised a chance at safety and a new beginning. But the journey had stripped her of every illusion. Each mile had reminded her that she was alone, traded and chosen by strangers who knew nothing of her heart. Still, she lifted her chin, refusing to let fear show. Survival had taught her that dignity was the one thing no one could take unless she surrendered it. Across the platform, a tall man stood with a small boy wrapped in an oversized coat. The man's shoulders were broad from years of ranch work, his face carved by wind and responsibility. He was a widower, though grief showed not in tears but in the careful way he kept his distance from hope. The boy clung to his gloved hand, eyes wide with curiosity and caution, watching the woman step into the snow. This was not how the rancher had imagined Christmas Eve. He had agreed to the arrangement for practical reasons: a woman to help keep the house, a steady presence for his child, a solution to loneliness he never spoke aloud. Yet when he saw her standing there in rags, shivering but unbowed, something tightened in his chest. She did not look like a burden. She looked like someone who had already endured too much. The wind howled between them, filling the silence with ice and doubt. He hesitated, aware of the unspoken contract that tied them together. She noticed his pause and braced herself, expecting disappointment, perhaps rejection. Instead, he stepped forward and removed his coat, placing it around her shoulders without a word. The simple act stunned her more than the cold had. "Let's get you out of this storm," he said quietly. The boy looked up at her, studying her face with solemn interest. "It's Christmas Eve," he murmured, as if that explained everything. She managed a small smile, touched by his innocence, and nodded. As they walked toward the waiting wagon, the snow thickened, erasing the station behind them. She wondered if this ranch would be another place where she was unwanted, or if it might finally offer rest. He wondered who this woman truly was beneath the worn clothes and tired eyes, and why. For the first time in years, he felt the faint stir of hope. That night, under a sky heavy with snow, 3 strangers began a journey not bound by ownership or obligation, but by a fragile, unexpected promise, one born on Christmas Eve, when worth was seen before words were spoken. The wagon creaked as it carried them away from the station, its wooden wheels struggling against the deep snow. The wind cut sharply across the open prairie, but the rancher guided the horses with steady hands, his posture calm and practiced. She sat beside him, wrapped in his heavy coat, the wool rough but wonderfully warm. The boy nestled between them, half asleep, his small breath puffing like smoke in the cold night air. She expected questions probing, suspicious, unkind. Instead, the ride passed mostly in silence. The rancher seemed to understand that words could wait. For the first time in days, she allowed herself to breathe without fear of being judged. The coat smelled faintly of leather and pine smoke, grounding her in the strange reality that she was no longer alone on the road. When the ranch finally appeared through the snowfall, it looked solid and enduring, lights glowing warmly from the windows. Not grand, but strong like the man who owned it. As the wagon stopped, the rancher jumped down and helped her to the ground, his touch respectful, careful. She noticed that detail, filing it away like a fragile treasure. Inside, the house was warm, filled with a comforting scent of wood smoke and something simmering on the stove. The boy shrugged off his coat and hurried to the hearth, holding his hands out eagerly. The rancher took her carpetbag and placed it near the door, then gestured toward the fire. "Sit," he said gently. "You must be frozen." She lowered herself onto a chair, her fingers stiff as she stretched them toward the flames. Heat seeped into her skin, painful at first, then soothing. She hadn't realized how deeply the cold had settled into her bones until it began to leave. For a moment, she closed her eyes, overwhelmed by the simple mercy of warmth. The rancher poured her a cup of coffee, black and steaming, and set it within reach. "Supper's simple," he added, almost apologetically. "But it's hot." Simple sounded like a blessing. She nodded, her voice caught somewhere behind gratitude and exhaustion. Watching him move about the kitchen, she noticed the quiet order of the place. Everything had its purpose, nothing wasted. This was a home shaped by responsibility, not indulgence. As they ate, the boy talked in soft bursts about the snow, about Christmas, about the dog that lived out back. She listened carefully, answering when spoken to, careful not to intrude. When she smiled at him, his face lit up and something softened in the rancher's eyes at the sight. Later, as the boy was sent to bed, an uneasy pause settled between the two adults. The unspoken truth hovered in the room. She was here because of an arrangement neither fully understood yet. She braced herself for rules, expectations, perhaps even a warning. Instead, the rancher cleared his throat. "You've had a long journey," he said. "There's a room ready. You can rest. We'll talk tomorrow." The words struck her harder than any demand could have. Rest. No conditions. No claim. She searched his face for hidden meaning and found none, only a steady sincerity that disarmed her defenses. "Thank you," she whispered, standing slowly. Her legs still trembled, but not from fear this time. As she lay later beneath thick quilts, listening to the wind batter the walls, she felt something unfamiliar settle over her safety. Not certainty, not love, but the possibility of kindness. In another room, the rancher sat by the dying fire, staring into the embers, realizing that the woman who had arrived in rags had already begun to change the rhythm of his quiet, lonely house. Morning arrived pale and quiet, the storm having spent itself in the night. Snow lay deep and untouched outside the windows, turning the prairie into a world of white stillness. She woke slowly, disoriented for a moment, then aware of warmth, real warmth, wrapped in thick quilts on a proper bed. It had been years since she de-slept without fear of being told to move on by morning. She dressed carefully in her worn clothes, smoothing the creases as best she could, and stepped into the kitchen. The rancher was already there, stoking the stove, while the boy sat at the table swinging his legs, humming to himself. The smell of fresh coffee and warm bread filled the room. It felt dangerously like belonging. "Morning," the rancher said, glancing up. His tone was neutral but kind, as though he were determined not to frighten this fragile piece. She returned the greeting softly and moved to help without being asked. Old habits guided her hand setting plates, wiping the table, keeping herself useful. The rancher noticed, a flicker of concern crossing his face. "You don't have to earn your breakfast," he said gently. The words landed deep, stirring a long-buried ache. She paused, then nodded, forcing herself to sit. As they ate, the boy chattered happily, breaking the tension with questions about the train and the city she'd come from. She answered honestly but simply, avoiding details that still burned too much to share. When the boy was sent outside to check on the animals, silence settled again. The rancher poured more coffee, his hand steady, his expression thoughtful. "I should say something," he began. "About why I agreed to this." She braced herself, fingers curling around her cup. "My wife passed 3 winters ago," he said quietly. "Since then, it's just been the boy and me, I thought. Having someone here might make things easier. For him. For the house." He met her eyes. "Not because I needed to own someone," her breath caught. She had expected obligation, not honesty. She found her voice thin but steady. "My family sent me," she admitted. "They said this was my chance. They didn't ask if I wanted it. They never do." She stared into her cup. "I came because I didn't have anywhere else to go." The truth sat between them, heavy but clean. No blame, no anger, just facts shaped by hardship. The rancher nodded slowly, as if absorbing the weight of her words. "Then we understand each other," he said. "This doesn't have to be more than what we choose." Something loosened in her chest at that. Choice. The word felt unfamiliar, almost dangerous. The boy burst back inside, cheeks red with cold, demanding to know if she'd stay for Christmas dinner. She laughed before she could stop herself, the sound surprising them all. The rancher smiled faintly, the first true smile she'd seen on his face. Later, as the day unfolded with small tasks and shared glances, she realized that while neither of them had healed, they had done something just as important. They had spoken the truth. And in that honesty, a fragile bridge had begun to form, one meal and one promise of choice at a time. The snow softened as the day wore on, the sky brightening into a pale winter blue. The ranch hummed with quiet life horses shifting in the barn, the distant creak of wood, the low whistle of wind along the fence lines. She followed the boy outside, careful on the packed snow, her breath fogging the air as he hurried ahead with uncontained excitement. "Come see," he insisted, tugging at her sleeve. "Papa says the calves like company." She smiled at his seriousness and let him lead her to the barn. Inside, the scent of hay and animals wrapped around them, warmer than the open air. The boy knelt beside a small stall, pointing proudly. She crouched next to him, her movements gentle, and spoke softly to the calf as if it could understand. The boy watched her with wonder, eyes shining. "You're not afraid," he said. She shook her head. "I've been afraid of many things," she replied. "But not this." That answer seemed to please him. He began talking freely then about his mother, gone but not forgotten, about how quiet the house used to feel, about how Christmas felt lonely without laughter. She listened without interrupting, offering him something he rarely received, full attention. From the barn doorway the rancher watched, unseen. He felt a familiar tightening in his chest, a mixture of gratitude and guilt. His son laughed, a real, unguarded sound, and it echoed through the barn like a promise. He realized how rarely he'd heard that laugh since his wife's passing. Later, inside the house, the boy followed her everywhere, handing her small tasks with great importance, holding flour while she mixed dough, carrying kindling for the fire, arranging pine branches on the table. Each time she thanked him sincerely, never dismissing his efforts. To the boy, she did not feel like a stranger or a visitor. She felt like someone who stayed. At one point, he climbed into her lap without asking, curling against her side as they sat by the fire. She froze for a heartbeat, afraid of overstepping, then relaxed when he sighed contentedly. Her arms came around him instinctively, protective and warm. The rancher saw it all. He said nothing, but something shifted deep inside him. He had worried about bringing a woman into his home, worried about confusion, about replacing what could never be replaced. Yet watching his child rest so easily against her, he understood that this was not replacement. It was healing. That evening, as the sky darkened early and snow began to fall again, the boy looked up at his father with quiet certainty. "I like her," he said simply. "She makes the house feel full." The words struck harder than any argument could have. The rancher met his son's gaze, then looked at the woman tending the fire, her face lit softly by the flames. In that moment, he saw what the rags had: hidden strength, patience, and a heart capable of giving without being asked. She did not know it yet, but the child had chosen her first. And in doing so, he had opened a door the rancher had long believed was closed forever. The storm passed in the night, leaving the ranch wrapped in a brittle, aching quiet. Morning light crept through the windows, pale and unsure, revealing the damage-broken boards, drifts piled high against the barn, signs of how close trouble had come. The rancher stood outside for a long time, surveying the land, his thoughts heavier than the snow on the fence rails. Inside, she moved softly about the house, careful not to disturb the stillness. Her body ached from the previous day, bruises blooming beneath her sleeves, but she welcomed the pain. It reminded her she had mattered when it counted. Still, a familiar fear crept in. She had stepped forward without thinking, but what if that courage made her unwanted? What if she had overstepped the invisible line? The rancher struggled with his own unrest. He had promised himself long ago that he would never bind another woman to his life out of duty or loneliness. Watching her risk herself in the storm had shaken that resolve. Respect had turned into something far more dangerous, something that asked for choice, not safety. At breakfast, their conversation stayed careful, circling the truth without touching it. The boy sensed the tension and grew unusually quiet, his eyes darting between them. When he was sent outside to play, silence settled thickly in the room. "I need to be clear," the rancher said at last. His voice was steady, but his hands were not. "What happened yesterday?" "I don't want you to feel you owe us anything." She looked at him then, really looked, and saw the fear he carried, the fear of becoming a man who took instead of asked. "I don't," she said softly, "but I need to know something too." He waited. "If you decide I'm not what you want," she continued, her voice trembling despite her effort, "tell me. Don't keep me because it's easier. I've been unwanted before. I won't survive being half chosen." The words struck deep. He had thought he was protecting her by keeping distance, when in truth he was protecting himself. He nodded slowly. "You deserve better than that," he said. "And so does my son." That night, as the boy slept, the rancher sat alone by the fire, staring into the flames. He realized that choosing her meant risking loss again, but not choosing her meant teaching his child that fear should decide a man as life. In the quiet of her room, she pressed her palm to her chest, feeling the steady beat of her heart. For the first time, she was not afraid of being sent away. She was afraid of staying, of hoping, of being chosen freely, and of discovering that love, once offered, could be real. Between them lay the same question, unspoken but powerful. Was courage found in holding back, or in choosing each other fully, despite the risk? The town gathered the morning after the storm, drawn together by necessity and routine. Repairs had to be made, supplies shared, news exchanged. The rancher hitched the wagon and invited her along, a simple gesture that carried unexpected weight. She hesitated only a moment before agreeing, smoothing her dress and steadying her breath. Being seen still frightened her, but hiding felt worse. The townsfolk noticed immediately. Eyes followed her as she stepped down from the wagon, her posture calm, her expression composed. Whispers rippled through the crowd, old judgments sharpening like knives. She felt them, every glance measuring her worth by her clothes, her past, the arrangement that had brought her there. A man near the store laughed softly. "So this is the bride who came with nothing," he said, not bothering to lower his voice. Before she could respond, the rancher stepped forward. His voice carried, firm and unmistakable. "She came with courage," he said, "and that's more than enough for this ranch." Silence fell. The words were not loud, but they were absolute. She stared at him, stunned not by the defense, but by the certainty behind it. He was not fulfilling an obligation. He was choosing. The boy slipped his hand into hers, grounding her as the moment passed. People turned back to their business, chastened, thoughtful. Some nodded to her with new respect. Others looked away. It no longer mattered. Later, as they loaded supplies, the rancher spoke quietly. "I won't pretend this is easy," he said, "but I won't let anyone treat you as less. Not here, not anywhere." Her throat tightened. "Thank you," she whispered, "for seeing me." He met her gaze. "For staying," he replied. On the ride home, the sky opened wide and blue above them, the snow glittering like scattered light. The ranch no longer felt like a place she'd been delivered to. It felt like ground she stood on by choice. That evening, as candles were lit and supper shared, the boy announced proudly, "She belongs with us." The rancher didn't correct him. Instead, he reached across the table, his hand open, waiting. She placed her own in his, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. In the clear light of day, before witnesses and doubt alike, she was chosen, not owned, not rescued, but claimed by love that asked and waited and honored her answer. The day after Christmas dawned crisp and clear, the snow glittering under a pale sun. Life on the ranch resumed its steady rhythm, and with it came the first true test of her place there. She rose before dawn, not out of obligation but instinct, quietly dressing so as not to wake the house. By the time the rancher entered the kitchen, she had the stove lit and water warming. He paused in the doorway, surprised. "You don't need to do all that," he said carefully. "I know," she replied, meeting his eyes. "I want to." Out on the ranch, word of her arrival traveled faster than the winter wind. Neighbors came with thinly veiled curiosity, ostensibly to offer holiday greetings, but really to inspect the mail-order bride who'd arrived in rags. Their eyes lingered on her worn dress, their smiles polite but sharp. She felt their judgment, old and familiar, but kept her chin high. When a neighbor's child slipped on the ice and scraped his knee, she was the first to kneel beside him, soothing his tears with calm words and gentle hands. When a pot boiled over during a shared meal, she laughed instead of apologizing, diffusing the tension with grace. Small moments, but they mattered. The rancher noticed everything. He saw how she worked alongside him, not shrinking from hard labor, not complaining when her hands reddened from cold. She learned quickly, asked questions without pride, and accepted correction without resentment. Most of all, she treated his son with patience and respect, never assuming authority, never pushing affection. Still, not everyone was convinced. A sharp-tongued woman from town remarked that such arrangements rarely ended well. "A woman like that knows how to make herself useful," she said with a thin smile. The words reached the rancher, stirring anger he hadn't expected. Before he could respond, she spoke calmly, "I know how to work. That's all I'm offering." There was no bitterness in her voice, only truth. That evening, as the visitors departed, the ranch felt quieter but different. The rancher leaned against the fence, watching her brush snow from her boots. "You don't have to prove anything to them," he said. She smiled faintly. "I'm not proving it to them," she answered. "I'm proving it to myself." The boy ran toward her, waving a crooked drawing he'd made of the three of them standing in front of the house. She knelt to admire it, praising his effort until he beamed. As night fell, the rancher realized that while others still saw her as an arrangement, she was already becoming something more, a steady presence, shaping the house not by demand, but by choice. The trouble came without warning, as it often did on the frontier. By late afternoon, Dark clouds rolled in low and fast, swallowing the pale winter sun. The wind shifted sharply, carrying the bitter scent of another storm. The rancher frowned at the sky, already calculating what needed to be secured before nightfall. "Stay inside with the boy," he told her, pulling on his coat. This could turn bad. She nodded, but unease settled in her chest as she watched him head toward the barn. The wind rose quickly, rattling the windows, snow whipping sideways in stinging sheets. The boy pressed close to her, asking when his father would return. She tried to sound calm as she answered, though her eyes kept straying to the door. A sudden crack of wood split the air, then another. She rushed to the window and saw part of the corral fence give way, boards torn loose by the gale. Worse still, one of the horses had broken free, panic driving it toward the open field. Without stopping to think, she grabbed her shawl and boots. The boy's frightened cry followed her, but she turned back only long enough to kneel and meet his eyes. "I'll help your papa," she said firmly. "You stay here where it's safe." Outside, the storm was vicious. Snow blinded her, wind stole her breath, but she pushed forward, following the rancher's shouts. She found him struggling with the frightened horse, his footing uncertain on the ice. Together, without words, they moved, she calming the animal with steady murmurs while he secured the rope. Her hands burned with cold, her muscles screamed, but she did not let go. A final gust knocked her sideways. The rancher caught her just in time, pulling her close to keep them both upright. For a heartbeat, they stood there, breathing hard, snow plastered to their clothes, the storm raging around them. In that instant, something shifted, fear mixed with trust, necessity with care. They made it back to the house soaked and shaking. She immediately tended to him, insisting he sit by the fire while she fetched dry clothes. He tried to protest, but she fixed him with a look that brooked no argument. Later, as the storm howled outside, the boy hugged her fiercely, relief pouring out of him. The rancher watched the scene, his voice quiet when he finally spoke. "You didn't have to come out there." "Yes," she replied simply. "I did." He understood then that this was no arrangement of convenience. When the storm had left no choice, she had chosen them without hesitation, without fear of the cost. By the time winter began to loosen its grip on the prairie, something had already shifted between them. The ranch no longer felt like a place of careful steps and unspoken rules. It had become a space where truth pressed gently but insistently, asking to be named. The snow still lingered in the shadows of fences and barns, but the days stretched longer, and with each lengthening hour came the understanding that what they were building could not remain undefined. The moment arrived quietly, without drama. One afternoon, as pale sunlight spilled across the yard, they worked side by side repairing a broken gate near the creek. The boy played close by, his laughter floating on the cold air. The ordinary nature of the scene made it safer somehow, as though honesty belonged more naturally to work and open land than to formal words spoken indoors. She was the first to stop. Resting her hammer against the post, she gathered her courage. For most of her life, decisions had been made for her by family, by circumstance, by hunger and fear. Staying silent now would be easier. But silence had cost her too much already. "I need to know this isn't another arrangement," she said softly. "I need to know that if I stay, it's because you want me, not because the house runs smoother or your son smiles more." Her voice did not accuse, it simply asked. Still, the question carried the weight of old wounds of being kept only as long as she was useful. She did not look away when she spoke, refusing to shrink from the answer, whatever it might be. The rancher leaned against the gate, his expression serious, reflective. He had lived with duty for so long that it had become second nature duty to his land, to his child, to the memory of his late wife. Wanting something for himself felt selfish, even dangerous. Yet he knew with sudden clarity that continuing without naming his choice would be the cruelest thing of all. "I don't want a woman who stays out of need," he said at last. "I want a partner who stays because she chooses us, because she believes in this life and in me." His voice faltered slightly. "And because I choose her every day." The honesty between them felt like fresh air after a long winter indoors. They spoke then of fears they had kept buried. He admitted how losing his wife had taught him to guard his heart, how loving again felt like inviting loss back into his life. She confessed how being treated as expendable had left her terrified of hoping, of believing she could be cherished without conditions. That evening, after the boy had been tucked into bed, the rancher returned from his room carrying a small velvet box. There was no audience, no ceremony, only the fire's soft glow and the steady sound of their breathing. He placed the box in her hands as if it were something precious and fragile. "This isn't payment," he said quietly, "and it isn't a promise to trap you here. It's an invitation only if you want it." Inside lay a simple ring, unadorned but strong, much like the life they shared. Her eyes filled with tears, not from shock, but from relief. For the first time, an offer came without pressure, without fear. "I choose this," she said, slipping the ring onto her finger, "and I choose you." In that moment, there were no chains binding them, only two people standing freely in the truth of their choice. Winter might still linger outside, but inside the ranch, something enduring had already begun to bloom. Spring did not arrive with fanfare on the prairie. It came quietly, in small mercies, the drip of melting snow from the eaves, the dark soil reappearing beneath retreating drifts, the creek beginning to murmur again after months of silence. For the ranch, and for the people who lived there, it marked not just a change of season, but the confirmation of something already decided. The wedding was modest, held beneath an open sky that stretched endlessly in every direction. There were no ornate decorations or elaborate vows, only wildflowers gathered by small hands and tied with twine, and a handful of neighbors who had come to witness what had once been doubted. When she stood beside the rancher, dressed simply but with quiet confidence, the memory of rags and judgment faded into irrelevance. What mattered was the certainty in her posture, the calm strength in her eyes. She was not being claimed, she was choosing. The rancher spoke his vows plainly, his voice steady with conviction rather than ceremony. He promised partnership, respect, and honesty, acknowledging the past without letting it define the future. When she spoke, her words carried the weight of a life spent surviving. She vowed not obedience but commitment, to stay, to build, and to love freely, so long as choice remained mutual. Their hands clasped not as a contract, but as a shared decision. Between them stood the boy, small fingers wrapped firmly around theirs as if anchoring the moment in truth. His presence made clear what this union truly was, not the joining of two lonely adults, but the forming of a family shaped by care rather than blood alone. When the vows were finished, his smile said more than any applause ever could. Life after the wedding unfolded without illusion. There were still early mornings, sore muscles, and days when the work felt endless. Disagreements arose, as they always do between people who live closely and honestly together. But now, no one feared being sent away for speaking too boldly or needing too much. The rancher learned to listen without retreating into silence, and she learned that she did not have to earn her place through exhaustion. The boy thrived in the steadiness of it all. He slept through the night without waking in fear, laughed freely, and spoke of the future with confidence. To him, she was not a replacement for his mother, but a new source of safety, someone who stayed when seasons changed and storms came. Through him, they both learned that love does not erase what was lost, it grows beside it. As the weeks passed, the ranch itself seemed to respond. The house filled with warmth and sound, the land tended with renewed purpose. Where there had once been survival, there was now intention. Where there had once been loneliness, there was shared silence that comforted instead of hurt. One evening, as the sun dipped low and bathed the prairie in gold, the three of them stood together at the edge of the field. The wind moved gently through new grass, carrying the scent of earth and promise. She leaned into the rancher's side, his arm settling around her with ease, the boy's hand tucked securely into hers. Once she had arrived on Christmas Eve believing her worth was measured by what she could give. Now she understood it was measured by who she was and by the courage it had taken to stay, to choose, and to be chosen in return. What began in hardship ended in belonging, not ownership, not rescue, but a home built deliberately, lovingly, and freely strong enough to endure every season yet to come.